and welcome to City Watch, a watchdog program for social, economic, political, and cultural issues here in New York City. You were just listening to Con Sabor Latino, and I'm happy you're still sticking with WBAI. Hopefully you're not stuck in traffic this Labor Day weekend. Hopefully you're enjoying the weekend. I'm your host, Jeff Simmons, and I'd like to thank you for staying with WBAI today with our new opening music, Windy and Warm by Tony Rice, at our new time at 6 o'clock, and with a harder focus on current events that impact our city and our world. I'm happy to be back after a few weeks on vacation, though never far away from the news and newspapers. I'm old school. I still need hard copies of newspapers in my hands as much as possible. I am excited about this new time. Since in the weeks ahead, we're going to be focusing on an issue that's been on my mind and from the looks of things has been growing in urgency and will continue to be this month, and that is climate change. Throughout the month of September, we're going to be talking with environmental justice leaders at the city, state, and federal levels about climate change and related environmental issues. The conversation is timed with the UN Climate Summit, and that takes place from September 21st to 23rd. And then Climate Week NYC, which is a week-long series of climate-themed events across the city from the 23rd to the 29th and hosted by the Climate Group. So this month, when you tune in every Sunday at 6, our hosts, which are also going to include Bakafam and welcome back, Joel Berg, will be engaging in thought-provoking discussions. And we're going to explore everything about the environment and labor issues, including green jobs, the intersection of environmental and criminal justice, and the impact of climate change on communities of color. I also do want to remind our listeners that at WBAI, we really enjoy bringing you special coverage. So tomorrow, Monday, Labor Day, is no exception. Throughout the day, you're going to enjoy special coverage from 6 in the morning till midnight. And that's going to start with coverage of the annual West Indian American Day Carnival from 6 a.m. till 6 p.m. In association with the West Indian American Day Carnival, WBAI's Midnight Ravers, Sean Rhodes, Isaac Ferguson, Terry Wilson, Oscar Avell, Sharon Gordon, and Sir Henry Eccleston will feature music, discussion, and cultural news, as well as reports on the costumes and food offerings at the carnival. When I was a reporter, I used to cover the carnival. It was one of my favorite events of the year. There also will be the dispatches from the Eastern Parkway venue throughout the day. So tune in all day for WBAI's Juve and West Indian Day coverage. Now then at 6 o'clock tomorrow, stay with WBAI, because then the esteemed Mimi Rosenberg as well as Ken Nash, they're going to step into the studio for a Labor Day special from 6 until midnight. And Mimi tells me she's going to start that evening off with a special tribute to West India labor, capping it off with an interview with the Calypso King of the World, the Mighty Sparrow. Through the evening, Mimi is also going to provide a theatrical reenactment of the history of this country through its earliest resistance and organization of the working class, as well as a virtual labor rally. And you're also going to hear from worker activist theoreticians about mobilizing movements for jobs and reparations around human rights and for a Green New Deal. I most certainly am going to tune in because I want to hear more viewpoints about the Green New Deal, and that is one of our topics tonight. So every fall for decades, the UN General Assembly has met at UN headquarters here in New York City, and it is attended by representatives from every country to discuss global matters like peace, economics, and the climate. Coinciding with the General Assembly is the UN Climate Action Summit from September 21st to 23rd, and then, as I mentioned, Climate Week NYC. The climate crisis is a mounting issue. Global warming affects every part of our lives, from our buildings, wetlands, water supply, energy demand, rising sea levels, to our health and our very existence. And it is frustrating that some leaders believe that this is a hoax, even as evidence is mounting every day, whether it's through superstorms, like we're seeing right now, melting polar ice caps, debilitating heat waves, wildfires, and more. In the words of presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, even earlier this afternoon in a tweet, if you don't believe in climate change, you should not be in Congress. And as Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said earlier this year, quote, "We don't have time to sit on our hands as our planet burns. For young people, climate change is bigger than election or re-election. It's life or death." And it is the death of our planet. So today, as we begin the first of 5 episodes of City Watch focused on climate change, we're going to launch into a discussion with several people who are leading the fight to address such change before it's too late. And joining me in studio for this hour is going to be climate change activist Adrien Salazar. And later during the show, we'll hear from Pete Sikora from New York Communities for Change, and then Roxana Rivera, whose union, 32BJ SEIU, for years has made climate change a central focus. And I'm glad she's able to join us this Labor Day weekend. And then we will open up our phone lines during the last part of the show because we want to hear from you. That number to call in the end of the show is 212-209-2877. The number to call during the last part of the show is 209-2877. That's a 212 number. So let's get to it. I want to first welcome in studio today, very happy he's here, Adrien Salazar, writer, climate justice advocate, and campaign strategist at Demos, a racial and economic justice policy organization where he fights for climate change policy at the local, state, and national level that centers racial and economic equity. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me here, Jeff.
So, Adrien, first, give our listeners just a brief bio of yourself and how you got involved in this issue.
So, personally, I was born in the Philippines and immigrated to the United States when I was very young and grew up in California. And I have family today who have been impacted by the climate crisis, both in the Philippines and in California. My family in the Philippines has felt the impacts of typhoons, and they live with the reality of a climate-changed world where these storms are experiencing increasing severity, and they have to think about how their livelihoods are going to be impacted and at risk in the future. And I have a niece and nephew who are 3 and 2 years old, living in California with my sister and her family, who have to deal with the smoke and decreased air quality from the wildfires that we've been seeing. They live in Northern California, and in the last 2 years, you've seen these really intense wildfires, and the air quality decrease in 100 square mile radius. So for my family, they have to think about whether or not they can take their children outside for weeks at a time as a result of these fires. And I think that experience is the experience of many people in the United States, and particularly of a lot of people in the global South who are facing the dramatic impacts of climate change today. And I came into this work because for me it was a personal issue. It was something that was impacting my family and a lot of people who are on the front lines. Mostly people of color and low-income communities who are the most vulnerable to the climate crisis.
And I mentioned that you work with Demos. Can you just tell folks a little about Demos?
Yeah, so Demos is a racial and economic justice policy organization, as you mentioned earlier, that works on a slew of issues from democracy reform, money in politics, campaign finance, to education policy and workers' issues. And climate is one of our focus areas that I came into the organization to help build. And we come through it through a climate justice lens. We view the climate crisis as layered onto existing social and economic injustice. And, when you see storms coming through, like Hurricane Dorian, that's about to make landfall in the continental U.S., but, historically, Katrina, Hurricane Maria that struck Puerto Rico and Florida, and Irma, and again, like these wildfires and all these different things. These are terrible tragedies and catastrophes, but they also exacerbate existing inequality. And the communities that are usually most at risk are those that have faced historic poverty, communities of color who have faced the burden of pollution and other impacts like lack of access to stable housing or a strong resource base. And so when these disasters strike, these are the communities that are most dramatically impacted. So you have to design policy to invest in these communities, to also address historic inequality. And that is the way that we approach climate policy at Demos, is making sure that any climate policy, whether it's at the local, state, or federal level, is centering the needs, the voices, and the histories of communities at the front lines of this crisis.
And as far as the campaigns that you execute, that involves rallies, testifying. What are some of the actions that Demos takes?
Yeah, so for the most part, we are a policy shop. We really do a lot of research, policy development. We were engaged in the fight to pass the New York climate bill, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was passed this past legislative session. We worked very closely with partners here across the state in the New York Renews Coalition that moved that bill forward. And we do all kinds of support, from helping design the policy to providing support and lobbying, going up to Albany to speak with legislators, and working with our allies to support the organizing that they're doing.
So I had read your testimony. You testified before the New York State Assembly Committee on Environmental Conservation at their hearing on climate change, and you had said, quote, "It's not just a climate bill, it's also a racial justice bill, a public health bill, and an economic development bill." Ultimately, when this was inked, did you get everything that you wanted?
Yeah, so the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, first of all, is an enormous achievement, because it puts New York, one of the largest economies in the United States and in the world, on a path to reducing emissions by 85% by 2050, and directing investments to those communities that I mentioned earlier who are most vulnerable. And this piece of legislation does exactly what I suggested earlier. It is baked into the legislation ways to address social and racial inequality by ensuring that climate policies don't disproportionately impact those communities, by ensuring that we invest jobs and infrastructure improvements in those communities. So it was, when it was passed and eventually signed into law by the governor just several weeks ago, one of the most aggressive climate legislation in the country. And there were, in fact, pieces that were written into the legislation that we didn't get. So one important piece, and maybe our partner from SEIU later will speak about this, is in the original bill, and if listeners are interested, the original bill was called the Climate Community and Protection Act, the CCPA. The bill had several protections for the jobs that would be created in a transition to a renewable energy economy. And this included labor standards, training and apprenticeship investments. And that section actually was removed in the negotiations in the final weeks and days of the legislative session. So there were various pieces like this that we fought for very hard. And the way that a lot of this, sometimes closed door backroom trading goes in the last hour, especially here in New York State, where we have witnessed a remarkable a progressive session, passing bill after bill after bill, and so many in the last minute. A lot of these things got wiggled out, and so we fought as hard as we could to make it as bold as possible.
And some of these elements that did not ultimately make it in, do these become part of Demos's agenda over the coming session, for instance?
Yes, absolutely. So the work of the coalition, the New York Renews Coalition, that moved this bill forward, which is a coalition of over almost 200 groups now across the state, from environmental groups to racial justice groups to labor, is to actually ensure that the implementation of the bill, the state and the various agencies that will be doing the work actually meet the targets. And that means that some of these pieces will be fought over through many, many hearings, right? And working with our legislators, working with agency officials like the staff at NYSERDA and the DEC, in order to make sure that the plans that they put forward actually meet the requirements of the bill. And part of this will also be going back to our allies in the legislature to say, hey, what are some of the improvements that we can make in this bill? Are there some amendments that we can make going forward? Are there new pieces of legislation that we need to introduce in the next session to make sure New York continues to be a leader on climate?
Who were some of your strongest allies in the state legislature?
So the sponsors of the bill in the assembly were Assembly Member Steve Engelbright from Long Island, and on the Senate side, Senator Todd Kaminsky. So these two folks really spearheaded the effort throughout the session to get the bill moving forward. And we also relied on many allies throughout the session to really make sure that the bill was as strong as it could be. And we had folks like Senator Julia Salazar, Senator Jessica Ramos, Senator Robert Jackson, who's my senator, who were very strong advocates for the equity elements of the bill in the Senate side, and many assembly members who signed on for supporting the bill, especially on the racial equity piece. So, for example, the Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, Asian caucus of the legislature, which has many, many members in the assembly, actually put out a letter saying they supported the CCPA to be as strong as possible and to retain all the equity elements of the bill.
So we're talking about the efforts of our legislature, and I'm really curious about the individual responsibilities. As we're talking about climate change, we can't just count on our government to do everything, especially when you look at our federal government right now and a president who believes climate change is a hoax. But when it comes to the individual, where does the responsibility lie with me and with others and what we should be doing?
Yeah, so a lot of people get caught up into this idea, like, if I do I have to stop flying, or do I need to not drive a car? Should I stop bringing plastic bags to getting plastic bags at the grocery store? I think these are all really important things to think about and to figure out how you can individually incorporate ways that you reduce your own consumption and your dependence on gas and other fossil fuels in your life. But what's really important when we think about this crisis, there are perpetrators, and the majority of the emissions that are producing global warming have been produced by 100 companies, and we know the names of those companies. And so in terms of the effect of action any individual or collectively people can make, actually trying to get, for example, fossil fuel money out of politics, trying to pass bold legislation like the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and trying to persuade our government to make bold moves in the international negotiation space, in passing federal legislation, is some of the most important work that we can do. And getting involved in local politics at the city level, at the state level, and at the federal level is what I feel like is actually going to get us there.
And given that it's Labor Day weekend, one of the things that's been on my mind is about unions, and about the role of unions moving ahead if a Green New Deal passes. And when you look at the initiatives that have passed at a city level and a state level, talk a little about the job creation and how these measures impact, the energy sector.
Yeah. So a lot of folks who criticize environmental regulation and even climate change policy say that these sorts of policies are job killers, right? You're telling people who depend on coal and oil and gas industry that basically their livelihoods are done. And in some ways, we have to think very critically about how we support the workers who are dependent on those industries as we transition over the next decade, over the next couple of decades. How do we invest in those communities? How do we give workers alternative training? And that was some of the thinking in the labor provision of the bill that we didn't end up having. In New York State, for example, we have 13,000 workers, about 13,000 workers who are in the fossil fuel industry, which is not as large as some other states, but that's a manageable number of workers and families that we can think about what kind of substantial programs can provide a just transition for those communities and those families. The other thing that I would say is that actually environmental policy, and particularly climate policy that works to transition our economy to a renewable energy economy, creates jobs. On net, in New York, we found there was a study by the University of Hammersmith's Political Economy Research Institute that showed if New York put itself on a path to 100% renewable energy by 2050, that would generate over 200,000 jobs for the state in the first decade, and it would create over $138 billion in income for New Yorkers, and that would be generated and circulated in the economy and really provide a lot of the kind of economic development that we want to see. So when we think about this is mirrored in many of the climate proposals that are out there, even at the federal level. Senator Sanders put out his Green New Deal climate policy proposal, and it says that it will produce 20 million jobs, right? So when we think about climate policy, it really is about a transformation of the economy and how do we invest in the kind of economy that we need, that is green, that is also supporting families and workers.
And so we're going to bring up our next guest in just a moment, and Adrien's going to stay with us throughout the show. Also, if he has questions, he's going to pose them to the other guests as well, and then we're going to open up the lines at the end. But before we do that, please tell our listeners who may not be able to stay with the show how they can learn more about you and your work in Demos.
Yes, you can follow Demos's work online. Our website is demos.org. That's demos.org. We're on Twitter at Demos_org, Demos_org. And I am on Twitter at ADRIEN4EJ. That's ADRIEN, the number 4EJ.
Adrien Salazar, thank you for staying with us this show today. We're going to bring up our next guest in just a moment. So we resist, we fight, we build power. That's the mantra of New York Communities for Change, which resists policies that affect our most vulnerable communities. Climate change and inequality are two of the great moral crises of our time. And New York Communities for Change fights for bold, transformational change at the scale of the crisis and demands policies for 100% renewable energy while creating good union jobs for communities of color. Joining me now to discuss this and more is Pete Sikora, the Climate and Inequality Campaigns Director at New York Communities for Change. Welcome to WBAI, Pete.
Hey, thanks so much. Boy, we sound great.
Well, explain for our listeners a little more. That was the synopsis. Talk a little about what New York Communities for Change does and what it focuses on, particularly when it comes to climate change.
Sure. We're community organizers who fight for economic, racial, and social justice. Now, climate justice in New York City and New York State. And so where Adrien and Demos is supporting work of organizations like ours, on the policy end and on the research side, we're sort of bringing the heat in the street, if you will, the activism, the organizing, the protests, the lobbying, getting communities involved, particularly Black and brown communities.
And talk more about your organization's role, the role that it played in advocating for New York's Green New Deal style program. Where did you succeed and what wasn't addressed?
So, we're facing a horrific crisis. Dorian in the Caribbean and the Atlantic is, bringing home yet again the climate crisis. It's a Category 5 hurricane, and it's going to do devastation, unfortunately. That's the future that we can expect if the climate crisis is not addressed. That is, if pollution is not slashed radically. And by radically, we mean extraordinarily fast, faster than people really grasp, is scientifically necessary to stave off catastrophe. That transformation is an enormous job creation opportunity, as Adrien has been eloquently describing. So what we're trying to do is cut fossil fuel use, increase clean energy use, and increase energy efficiency. So New York City just enacted a transformational new law over the objections of the real estate industry to require large buildings like Trump Tower, big buildings, to move to high energy efficiency standards, which will cut their pollution enormously. And those are the top polluters in New York City. So we'll be reducing our climate footprint in New York City a lot and creating a lot of good jobs in energy efficiency in the process. So we did a lot of work to get that law passed. We're very proud of it, and we want to see it succeed.
And, one of the leaders in that who's going to be a guest on this show next Sunday night at 6 is New York City Councilman Kostek Konstantinidis, in fact.
Oh, he's the man. It's great. It's great you're having him on.
So, in researching, your background and what your organization does, when the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act had passed, you, while applauding the fact that it had passed, you still issued a very tough statement saying that certain provisions had been, quote, gutted and or watered down. Can you talk about that?
Sure. The bill that passed is strong on cutting climate pollution, although we think it should be a lot stronger. It codifies into law a lot of goals and recommendations and executive orders that the state had previously issued. New York State, backing up for a moment, is at only 5% use of wind and solar on the electrical grid. There are almost no zero emissions cars on the road. We're emitting enormous amounts of climate pollution from this state. That needs to drop extraordinarily rapidly. And so the new law goes a long way towards putting into requirements that actually happen. Not as fast as we'd like, but still, it's there. What it doesn't do is do enough to require money and emphasis and good union jobs, particularly in communities of color, low-income communities of color. So the governor unfortunately gutted those provisions as the law was passed. So he was very opposed to those kinds of requirements, and in the end, they didn't see the light of day. So unfortunately, the law, while tackling climate pollution in a pretty reasonable way, does not also fight inequality in the way that it should.
Thanks. I just wanted to add to that we really worked hard on trying to make sure that those pieces of the policy passed. And Pete is absolutely correct. The bill was in many ways a disappointment on the equity side, because these are the pieces that, at least for Demos, and I'm hearing also for NYCC, that they were in the fight for, right? And so it's very disappointing to see some of these labor provisions not pass in the final bill, and to see some of the other equity elements watered down. And I'll say that the bill, like Pete said, was very strong in setting a standard for emissions reduction. At the same time, there were also a few provisions that did address equity, like there's a climate equity screen, which requires all of the implementation of the bill to assess whether or not there are disproportionate impacts across different communities, which is very unique. And actually, a few of the presidential candidates have looked at this as an example for something that they could model nationally.
And in fact, Pete, that was one of the things that's been on my mind, because Jay Inslee, while he was running, really elevated, I felt, for running for president, elevated the discussion about climate change. I'm glad to see that I think it might be this week or next week that CNN is doing its town hall just on climate change issues. Pete, how significant do you think climate change is going to be as far as a topic that motivates voters to support a candidate, a presidential candidate, during this season?
Very significant. You can see all of the Democratic presidential candidates moving to release aggressive plans. And Senator Sanders is the most aggressive of anyone who's running at this point. It's pretty incredible. The reason that they're doing that is not just because they're wonderful human beings, unlike Trump. It's because they're seeing the polling and the base of the Democratic Party becoming extremely concerned about this issue. In the last few years, particularly in the last year, the public, particularly Democratic voters, have become much more concerned about climate change. It used to be a kind of, that's, we're sympathetic to that, but there's so many other more important issues. And now it's right at the top of the list of what Democratic primary voters care about. So poll after poll has demonstrated that, and the presidential candidates are reacting to that. Now, we can't just let them off with producing plans. We got to elect them, but then hold them accountable to actually delivering on that. So that's our challenge as activists, is to make them do the things that they say they're going to do, make those things better, and make them actually do it. So we want to see that happen.
And, as I've mentioned several times during the show, this being Labor Day weekend, my mind goes to the impact on unions. And if we're talking about job creation, talk a little more specifically about the vision that New York Communities for Change has, that a lot of these jobs be unionized.
There's a huge new industry forming up, huge. Renewable energy is going to grow. Energy efficiency is going to grow. The New York City law, to put it in perspective, will, by a bunch of studies, generate billions of dollars in economic activity and tens of thousands of jobs. Now, right now, a new industry is forming up that is replicating a lot of the problems of the current economy. Not good enough, not enough good union jobs. And a lot of the best jobs, and certainly the capital ownership structure, is not reflective of the population of New York City or America. And by that, it's white-owned, and the investors and the capitalists who make money off of it are predominantly extraordinarily wealthy people who are white. We want to change that so that a lot more of the industry that is being developed is actually going to benefit the people who need it the most, that is low income and communities of color. So we need to maximize through public policy and through action the number of good union jobs hiring from low income communities and communities of color. So that's the kind of policy that we're pushing for.
So you've been listening to me, Jeff Simmons, on City Watch, WBAI, New York 99.5 FM, and streaming live at WBAI.org. In studio is guest Adrien Salazar of Demos, and also on the line right now is Pete Sikora from New York Communities for Change. In our final minutes, Pete, just want to get a sense from you about what your organization will be doing this month, since so much of the focus of activities will be on climate change-related issues.
Oh, there's a lot coming up this month, right? So the CNN forum that you mentioned is going to be at Hudson Yards, and all the candidates will be there talking about their climate plans. We'll be outside protesting, urging them all to oppose fracking and call for a national ban on fracking, stopping fossil fuel infrastructure, and doing the kind of climate plan that we've been describing, that Adrien and I are talking about, which is a transition towards a future that's equitable and just. So join us outside at Hudson Yards right before the CNN forum. We'll be protesting out there along with hundreds of other activists and our members. And then throughout the week, throughout the month, you can go to our Facebook page, New York Communities for Change, or our website and see the different protests and activities we're doing. Please join us at any time. It's going to be very lively. On the 20th, there's a large international climate strike led by youth. These are high school students predominantly, inspired originally by a girl named Greta Thunberg, who is a Norwegian girl who has been striking, that is, staying out of school to protest inaction by adults like us.
And just arrived in New York.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Just came off a boat, literally. So we'll be fired up and in the streets on September 20th, joining the international climate strike, which we hope to be very large.
And just looking ahead at the next legislative session, beyond just this month's activities, what will be your priorities over this coming legislative session?
We want to tax the rich in Wall Street to fund a Green New Deal. We're going to need about the kind of program that is needed here, and the scale of the transformation is gigantic. In order for higher costs not to be passed on to lower-income communities, and for good jobs to be created and focused on those communities, we're going to need a lot of public money. So we're going to propose raising and spending about $10 billion a year from taxing the rich to fund a Green New Deal. We also want to ban new fossil fuel infrastructure, create public ownership of energy, and ensure 100% renewable energy. Those are all things that the law that was passed did not do, and we want to see done.
And once again, how can people learn more about you and your organization? Where should they go?
Oh, well, they can go to Facebook or our website, nycommunities.org, or they can go to @nychange on Twitter.
Great. Pete Sikora, thank you so much for joining me, Jeff Simmons, here on WBAI City Watch today.
Thank you. Have a great one.
Great. So as we get ready for our final guest, I want to remind our listeners that shortly we will be taking listener phone calls. We want to know your views on climate change. If you think, like the president says, that it's a hoax, or if you are looking at science and believe, well, this is happening, something is happening, and what should be done about it? Are our legislators doing enough? Are they? Where should they be focused? Where haven't they been focused? I'm joined in studio by Adrien Salazar from Demos, who talked a little about his entree into this field and about his personal feelings about given your family's experience. And I'm really curious, when you look at what's happening in the Amazon and you're looking at or following the coverage about Dorian, and when you have a president who a short while ago said he had never heard of a Category 5 storm like this, and then of course everyone's correcting him and noting what's happened in the last few years. But how does it impact you personally? Do you feel like, are there moments where you feel like, despite all of our efforts, the world is going to pot, and we're, no matter what we do, it's not going to matter?
Well, that's an interesting question. There's actually this phenomenon now that you can, Google about, called climate depression, which is this idea that people are receiving so much intense news about these disasters on a daily basis and have a psychological impact on them about how they are going to live in a world that is increasingly unstable and is dramatically transforming. And it gives people a different, set of emotional and psychological responses. Some people withdraw, some people feel powerless. And as for myself, I feel like that those are reasonable responses, and people might have various emotional reactions to living in the times of apocalypse. But I think what energizes me is being able to take action. And I think in a crisis as huge as the climate crisis, which is global, it can feel difficult to address it, and you can feel like a small person. But when you connect with others, and as we've seen with these young people all over the world who are striking together, who are walking out of their schools, who are inspired by Greta Thunberg and other organizers like Chie Bastida and Alexandra Villaseñor here in New York City, who are moving and organizing young people, there is a lot of energy for people to come together and to build the solutions that they need to see.
So as we're trying to get our final guest on the line, we actually have a call that's coming in. Welcome to WBAI. What's your name and what's on your mind?
Yes, my name is Brother Mateen Muhammad, and I'm speaking on the situation that we are in today in the United States. These storms and hurricanes and everything and disasters will continue not only to come but increase, because as the sister said earlier who spoke, we have a lot of people in this country who's extremely oppressed, and the powers that be have the abilities and capabilities to let us go from oppression and put us in a situation where we don't have to be bothered with them, or they don't have to be bothered with us, which is basically separation. So as long as this separation doesn't take place, this country will continue to be plagued with all types of disasters, and it's talking about it in the Bible. And we must understand that the Bible is not just really a religious type of book. The Bible has been tampered with so much that people forget that the Bible is the ultimate scientist. People have been tricked into believing that God is some type of spook or spirit, but they don't believe God is a master scientist. And we must wake up and understand that this master scientist is now wreaking havoc on the United States of America. And I hate to say it, but some of the righteous are going to suffer too. But most of the righteous people will come out on top. Thank you very much for taking my call.
And thank you very much for calling into WBAI. So, Adrien, this month, what are some, where are you going to be? What are some of the activities you're going to participate in? I know you're a policy organization, but my sense is from you that you're very impassioned about this. So I'm curious where we're going to hear from you.
Yeah, well, I actually am super excited about the activities that Pete mentioned are happening at the end of the month around the climate summit and the strike that the youth are organizing on September 20th. I was, in fact, here witnessing Greta's arrival on her zero carbon emissions boat. It was really powerful to see several hundred people here welcome her. And I was also able to join the first school strike in New York, in New York City, and on U.S. soil that she participated in on Friday. And it's really exciting, this moment. I think not only is her presence bringing energy to this moment and the urgency of the climate crisis, but young people and other communities are getting galvanized around this. So I think people should really pay attention to the strike that is happening on September 20th. There's going to be the UN Climate Summit on the 23rd that is organized by the UN Secretary General, and there's going to be a lot of coverage of that and what comes out of it. This summit is a precursor to the next international negotiations on climate change that is happening in later in the fall in Chile. So the UN Secretary General is really asking for countries to make bolder commitments to reducing their emissions to get the world on track to addressing the climate crisis. So folks should really pay attention to what's coming out of this summit. And lastly, I'll just say that I'm also very concerned about all of these disasters that are happening. We'll see what happens, with Hurricane Dorian, and keep our thoughts to the people there. But the work that I do is really about supporting folks who are on the front lines, who are being impacted by these crises, and these folks are also leaders in building the solutions to the climate crisis. A lot of the policies that we talk about, the solutions, are being generated on the ground by people out of necessity. And so I'm interested in making sure that the voices of those folks are heard and that we amplify the solutions and look at them as models for other places in the country.
Thank you. And one of the voices we do want to hear from is Roxana Rivera, who is joining us now, our final guest today. Roxana is part of the leadership at 32BJ SEIU, which is leading the unions, and she's leading the union's work in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And in this region, 32BJ represents 20,000 workers, such as janitors, security officers, and skilled tradespeople at major universities like Harvard and Boston University and MIT, as well as private office buildings and public institutions. Unions have come around from years ago. Labor has had an evolving approach to climate change, so we're going to ask her about that today. Welcome to WBAI, Roxana.
Thank you for having me.
So first, tell me a little about your background and how you got involved with the union movement.
So my parents are from El Salvador. I didn't grow up with the union background. It was actually when I was a college student in the early 1990s in California, where we were facing some attack, some legislation that was trying to be pushed forward, anti-immigrant legislation. And I was working at a school because I was studying to be a teacher, and I was working with a group of immigrant parents that were facing immigration raids. And so I got involved, and actually the union came out and supported us in the community, and that's how I basically was introduced to the union and began working as an organizer.
And I know 32BJ has participated in the People's Climate March. Your former leader, who was a neighbor of mine in Jackson Heights, Hector Figueroa, he had pointed out in a previous interview about, many of the members of 32BJ live and work in communities that are affected by issues such as climate change. Talk a little about, why this is so important for 32BJ and the type of work that 32BJ does on climate change.
Yeah, so given who our workers are, the industries that we work in, cleaning and maintenance of buildings, property services, right? Obviously, we played a role in trying to basically lower carbon emissions and having, working on the issue of energy efficiency. And so we played a role with our own members and our own industry to try to play a role on that. And but also our members are largely immigrants and people of color, and so they live and work in the communities that are most impacted by climate change, and so that's why it's been important to us to be involved. And then our members also like we have members that are dealing with the lead in Newark, or were affected because of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, because their families are there, and as well as just folks that lived in New York and Hurricane Sandy, and we also have thousands of members that have temporary protective status that they were able to receive based on the environmental destruction in El Salvador and Haiti many years ago. But now, unfortunately, because of the Trump administration, they're facing an end to that program. And so, climate change and the impact of global warming and all of those things impact our members, not only in the workplace through the work that they do. Obviously, working with cleaning agents and being part of all that in their buildings, but also just the reality of their families and where they live.
And Hector at one point had said that we need to elect progressive leaders who embrace a climate change agenda. So given the progressive movement that I know Adrien and I had been talking about, are you seeing, are you more optimistic that these issues are going to get addressed, that we're going to see legislative remedies?
So I think that it takes folks pushing forward, and as folks have been bringing the issue of climate change to the forefront with the presidential election, and so we've seen more of at least the Democratic presidential candidates speaking more on this issue, and then also just on the local level being able to state by state really push forth legislation like the Climate Action Leadership Protection Act in New York. So I think it does take all of us talking more about it, and I think also connecting the issues, because I think it's not just an issue of climate change, but also of immigration and jobs. Like, all those things are connected when we talk about climate change. So that brings in, more folks into connecting the dots for people.
And in fact, that's one of the discussion points we've had during the show tonight, is the impact on jobs and how, these measures really alter the energy sector, and that, there are critics who believe, that, there will be significant loss of jobs. But how do you counter those critics?
So the thing is we all want a world that we can be able to live in, right? And climate change is a real thing, and there's, we have to step in to reverse the impact, right? Or else we're not going to have a world to live in. So it is important for workers to be part of that conversation, because obviously they're going to be impacted by it. And so there is a way, and I know that's why we were early supporters of the Green New Deal, because there is a talk about how these good jobs and climate change are tied together, right? And that we can actually look to, in thinking about a green industry, what good jobs can be created out of that, and a just transition for those communities that have relied, on the industry of carbon emissions, right?
So, Roxana, as we wrap up, can you tell me a little more about how people can find out more about the work that 32BJ does on climate change, and a little about what you might be doing this month when so much attention is on climate change issues?
So we're going to be, we're going to be continuing to talk to our members, but we're going to be, still continue to working with our allies in legislation that impacts climate change, and we're also going in Massachusetts. There's the Democratic Convention, and we've been asked as a union to do trainings there around climate change. Senator Markey, who's a sponsor of the Green New Deal out of Massachusetts, has been holding town halls, which I've actually been able to participate in. And we're going to be looking at how we can support the climate strike actions later this month.
So, Roxana Rivera, thank you so much for joining me, Jeff Simmons, here on WBAI today.
Great. Thank you very much.
So we've got a few minutes left. I'm going to have to wrap up shortly, but I do want to let our listeners know, if you still want to call in, the number to call is 212-209-2877. Adrien Salazar from Demos is hanging out, so he can also take your calls and answer any questions.
Yes.
So I do want to also remind our listeners that about our special programming tomorrow, just in case, I run out of time, that tomorrow from 6 in the morning till midnight, you need to tune in to WBAI all day. From 6 till 6, there's special coverage of the West Indian American Day Carnival, WBAI's Midnight Ravers, Sean Rhodes, Isaac Ferguson, Terry Wilson, Oscar Revelle, Sharon Gordon, and Sir Henry Eccleston will be featuring music, discussion, and cultural news and reports on the costumes and food offerings at the carnival. So you should tune in all day for that. And then from 6 till midnight, Mimi Rosenberg and Ken Mash will bring us a special Building Bridges episode, which is going on for 6 hours. Rise Up and Resist, a Labor Day celebration of the workers of the world. And Mimi tells me that they're going to begin with a special greeting to West Indian workers through the particular cultural iconography of the Calypso king of the world, the mighty sparrow. And throughout the day, you'll hear a reenactment of worker protest demands on the first Labor Day, recorded live at Union Square. That's just a taste of what is going to be going on from 6 until midnight. So the number to call is 212-209-2877. Do we have another caller on the line? Great. Welcome to WBAI. What's your name and what's on your mind?
Hey, Stephen from Queens. All I wanted to say is thank you for talking about climate change, because I am so sick of these tired old men who think that the world should be just like it was back in the days of Leave It to Beaver. They don't believe in anything, as I once heard a general say, anything I can't see. And they're determined to walk around in ignorance and bring everybody down with them. It's like the world should be just the way it was in 1959. And I say thank you for talking about this and forcing people to realize that there is another generation that hopefully will be left behind after we're all gone.
And thank you very much for listening to WBAI. I appreciate your call today. So, Adrien, in the final minute or few minutes that we have left, any final thoughts? Anything that you want our listeners to know that we did not get to today?
Well, just to respond to what that listener just shared, it is really critical that people get politically engaged if they're interested in addressing the climate crisis. I think a lot of people see the climate crisis as a problem of carbon molecules in the air and something like super technical, but it is actually a political challenge because we know what the science tells us. And the problem is that we have governments that have resisted and, in fact, elected officials who are climate deniers who don't want to take action on this critical global crisis. And in this coming UN summit, we've heard that Donald Trump is actually not going to be there. He's not a surprise, but he's also sending EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler, who is a former coal lobbyist and is a member of the Washington, I think it's called the Washington Coal Club. So this is the kind of people like this listener has suggested that are trying to hold back our ability to actually face this crisis. And luckily, we have strong allies here in New York State, in New York City, that have helped us move really bold legislation. I encourage listeners to get involved to make sure that we actually get the policies that we want to address this climate crisis in place.
And we've got another caller on the line. Welcome to WBAI. I've got about a minute left. So what's on your mind?
Okay, I'll read 5 lines. I'll read it fast. It seems clear to me that climate change is a problem which can no longer be left to future generations. When it comes to the care of our common home, we are living at a critical moment in history. Pope Francis.
Thank you very much for your call today. So as we close out the first of 5 episodes on climate change of City Watch, I want to thank our listeners for joining me on this new time at 6 o'clock. I want to thank my in-studio guest, Adrien Salazar of Demos, and our callers, Pete Sikora of New York Communities for Change and Roxana Rivera of 32BJ, our engineer, Max. Thank you. I look forward to working with you on Sunday nights at 6 o'clock, especially as we get into colder weather. I will be bringing the hot cocoa, or whatever you prefer, Max. And, of course, again, our listeners for weighing in. Stay tuned for what is coming up next. Stay tuned for Golden Age of Radio with Max Schmidt.